Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I am Sean. Today I am ranking books off the top 1000 list, 1000 books to read before you die by James Mustich. So let's get into it. First, there are no S tier books on this list. So beginning with A tier. A tier is a book that is really good. Everyone should read it. B tier is also a pretty good book. Not the best book in the world, but you should enjoy it, so it's definitely recommended. Both of those rankings are recommended. A and B tier books are recommended reads by me. C tier is a book that definitely has some potential, but that's really all I can say about it. It is just okay. It's definitely not one of my favorite books in the world. It's okay, so maybe you will enjoy it, but I cannot really strongly recommend it. Then we come to D tier, and I have to talk about D tier a little bit because there's going to be a lot of these books. If a book is in D tier, that means it just was not for me. So it doesn't necessarily mean it is a bad book at all. In fact, maybe I can't even say anything bad about the book. It's just a book that wasn't for me. Like, it may be poetry, something I'm not into, or maybe it was just the mental state I was in, like the emotional state. Maybe I just wasn't ready to handle this type of book. So at the time, it just wasn't for me. Maybe in the future, I would be willing to give books on D tier a try again. But for whatever reason, that book is just not for me. So I'm not going to say why each D tier book gets D tier, because the answer is always kind of the same. It's just a book that wasn't for me. Then finally, E tier is a book I actively disliked and rage quit. So that is a book where there was some specific thing or things about the book that drove me crazy, and I am basically not ever interested in picking up that book again, or maybe reading anything by that author again. I hated it. So going through these books alphabetically, the first book on the list is Foundation by Isaac Asimov. So this is my first read by an Isaac Asimov book, and this book was on my 24 books to read in 2024. I was projecting it a low ranking because I'm not a fan of science fiction or fantasy, but I began reading this book, and surprisingly, I read all of it. Now, I may be doing a solo review of this book, so I don't want to go in depth about it at all, but basically, it was just an all-around very good book, I thought. The pacing was very good, the tension was good, it kept moving, and in this case, it wasn't overly sciencey, I felt. So all in all, it was very digestible. It wasn't too spacey, it wasn't too sciencey, it just wasn't too much at all. Like, the language, the world building wasn't too much. It was all pretty plain to read and understand. And I think that's what Asimov liked to do. He liked to have writing where it's just plainly telling readers what is going on. So I surprisingly liked it. So Foundation by Isaac Asimov gets A tier. Next is John Berendt, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. I have a signed copy of this book. I'd never heard of it or the author before, but getting a signed book made me enthusiastic about it. I love signed books so much. This is a book that is set in Savannah, Georgia, and it's about a murder trial that goes on there, but it's also kind of fictionalized. So it's partly true crime or true courtroom stuff, and also fictionalized stuff. I liked parts of the writing in this book even very well. I thought some of the chapters were quite perfect and masterful. But I just kind of got tired of the book midway through. I didn't even get to the courtroom stuff or the murder stuff, because I read 150 pages and it still wasn't to that point yet. So the book was just kind of going too slow for me. I didn't want to read about the murder case because I'm not into books like that. I don't like legal books or courtroom books or whatever. But it was just not even getting there. It was too slow. So it definitely had some potential because of some very good chapters, but I kind of lost interest in the book. So this book gets C tier. Maybe it would be a C plus tier, it's real close to being a recommended read, but it just falls out of that, so C tier. Next is William Blake, Songs of Innocence, and this book is poetry, so that makes it instantly fall into D tier. Not for me. The next book is Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret by Judy Blume. So I did not know anything about this book. I had heard of it, of course. The title is real prominent, especially like the reference in Deadpool. But I didn't know anything about this book, so I didn't even know it was like young adult or middle grade book. So this book is basically about a young girl. I don't know her age exactly. I think she's somewhere around like 11 or so, 10, 11, 12. And basically the book is about like her wanting to get her period and stuff. And like it's about her friends and they're all like her girlfriends. And they're all talking about wanting to get their periods and talking about like which boys they may be interested in. So this is a book that's not really for me. It's more written, I think, for like, girls who are just about to go through this process. So it's not the type of book for me. But in spite of that, I actually liked this book and I read the whole thing and I thought it was pretty good. So I enjoyed it. So Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret gets B tier. Next is Giovanni Boccaccio, The Decameron. So this is another book. I did not know anything about it, but this book is basically like the Italian Arabian Nights. So Boccaccio wrote it while the Black Plague or the bubonic plague was going around. And this book is about a group of 10, mostly women and a few men, who go to like this house to avoid the plague. They like isolate each other. Isolate with each other, like, medieval social distancing. And so they go to this house and there's 10 of them. So they agree that every day they should tell a story. So there are 10 of them every day, 10 days. They tell 100 stories in all. And these stories are pretty risque. And this book got banned in its time because like a lot of the stories are about like, religion and especially about sex and stuff. And it's pretty, some grotesque stuff and some nudity and like scandalous stuff. I read about 25 or 30 of the stories. Again, there are 100 of them. And I liked about, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them. And then 5, 6, 7, 8 of them or so I thought were just okay. And then like 5, 6, 7, 8 of them were just, didn't do anything for me. But all in all, I kind of liked it. I thought there were definitely some more stories that I liked than I didn't like, and some of them I really thought were quite hilarious. So this is kind of a book where I would recommend it, but I would also at the same time acknowledge there are a lot of stories here, 100 of them. So maybe you'll only want to read like 5 or 10 of them, and I think that's cool. Like just try to find a list of like the best stories in this book and read those stories. And I think it's a good experience. So I give the Decameron B tier. I thought it was pretty enjoyable. It is like the Italian Arabian Nights or Canterbury Tales, and in a way I liked it more than either of those. It was pretty funny, some of the stories, so I do recommend it. Next is John Casey's Spartina. This is one of the books that's on my 24 books to read in 2024 list. I just did a February wrap-up where I talk about this book, and I thought the first chapter was okay, like it had some promise, like the characters and storytelling was okay. It's basically about this like middle-class guy who is building a boat in his backyard that is like his life's work. He wants to sell this boat for a lot of money, and he's like a lobster, or he's not a lobster, he's a, what do you call a person who catches lobster? A lobster man? A fisherman? I don't know. He's definitely not a lobster. But yeah, so he goes around fishing and crabbing, or not crabbing, lobstering. But after the first chapter, I just did not like this book at all. I did not like the character at all. This guy's name is Dick Pierce, which I thought is just real juvenile. And the author always uses his name. He doesn't say he says Dick. And he says it like every sentence. Dick looked. Dick walked. Dick said. And I'm just like, I get it. You're obsessed with Dick. So I didn't like this book at all. It really gets close to getting E tier, but it's just not quite that bad. I didn't hate it that much. It's definitely a book I did not like though. So this gets D tier, but definitely more like lower D tier. Next is This House of Sky by Ivan Doig. I was pretty optimistic or hopeful about this one because there are like 20 signed books by Ivan Doig at the bookstore, so I wanted to read this book off the top 1000 list, hopefully like it, and then maybe go and buy a signed Ivan Doig book. The first chapter I thought had some potential, but the biggest problem with this book was almost half of the book was in italics. And I do not like italics in books. I think they are hard on the eyes. They are distracting. So that alone really killed the book for me. But also, it just wasn't really working for me. So this book gets D tier. If it wasn't for the italics, I don't know, it may be better. It may have fallen into C tier or possibly B tier. But with all the italics, it's a D tier book. I just can't really read this because of all the italics. So, D tier. Next is Fyodor Dostoyevsky, Notes from Underground. This is one of his books that is on the top 1000 list. And this is another book I talk about in my recent February reading wrap-up. I just didn't like or care about this character at all. Basically, it's a book by this like retired government worker, and it's just like his reminiscing about his life and his like viewpoints on things. So I just didn't care about anything this guy said. It just wasn't working for me at all. So I just didn't like the book at all. It didn't do anything for me at all whatsoever. There was nothing good I could say about it for the writing, the storytelling, the character, the characterization. Just none of it worked for me. I didn't hate the book. I just didn't care about it. So it gets D tier, just solid D tier. Next is Alexandre Dumas, The Count of Monte Cristo. So I had previously read The Three Musketeers, and that book kind of drove me crazy because it was just so agonizingly long and boring, like a 150-page span where they're trying to like go up to England to recover a necklace, and it doesn't matter. In the end, it's all for nothing. That book drove me crazy. So I was real pessimistic about The Count of Monte Cristo, but a lot of booktubers have said this book is real good. They've raved about it, The Count of Monte Cristo. So that made me a bit more enthusiastic. So when I began to read it, the first maybe 100 pages I liked pretty well, about the first third of the book. But then it got to Rome, and when the Count of Monte Cristo falls into this money and he kind of becomes this like high society guy, and he embarks on this quest of revenge. I thought his quest, his revenge, his plot, his plan was just so confusing and so complex. It was just the stupidest, most insane plot ever. And so the book just kind of drove me crazy for that reason. And there were some other things about the book I don't want to go into that I didn't like. So this book, I did like it more than The Three Musketeers. The first third of the book was pretty good. I saw what other booktubers and stuff were talking about for this book. But after that point, the book just drove me crazy, and I didn't care about all this high society stuff, all these rich families talking about their problems with each other. And the Count's plot was just ridiculous, and just why would he come up with this real convoluted plot? I just had so many problems with that book. So it had potential, but because of the problems I had with the book, it falls into C tier. So not really recommended too much. Or what I should say here is I cannot recommend this book personally, but since other booktubers have raved about this book, you should probably read it. I mean, a lot of people really like this book, so you should probably go out and read it. But myself, it just didn't work for me. Next, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Lawrence Durrell or Lawrence Durrell, I don't know, but the book is Justine. This is the first book in a series of, I think, 4 books. And this book is like trying to be like a modern day Marquise de Sade. Marquise de Sade wrote this book called Justine, which this author like quotes at the start of the book. And I also talk about this book in my February reading wrap-up. And it just didn't work for me at all. I could not get into this book at all. The book was basically just words, 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 random character 1, something about sex, words, 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 random character 2, some line about sex, words, 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 words. And that was the whole book. And I didn't care about any of the characters. I didn't care about the plot, the setting, just nothing about the book worked for me. And unlike Marquis de Sade or Marquis de Sade or whatever his name is, however it's pronounced, Marquis de Sade had like real edgy sex scenes. Whereas with this, it was just like real weird references. Like, I think the guy literally said something like, he said some line about the weather and like used sex to describe the weather. I don't even know how to describe it. It was just some line like something, thank you, baby. It was some line along the lines of like, I don't know, the sexual clouds or something. I don't know, just the guy was so obsessed with trying to insert the word sex into like every 30th line of the book. So I thought the book was really just terrible. It did nothing for me at all. It wasn't an E-tier book. It wasn't a book I hated. I didn't care about the book enough to hate it. So it is just a solid dead center D-tier. Did nothing for me whatsoever. Next is The Epic of Gilgamesh, and I would kind of like to talk about this book because there are things about this book, The Epic of Gilgamesh, that are like, I might potentially use in one of my stories. So I was really excited and intrigued about reading The Epic of Gilgamesh for that reason. So I really quite enjoyed this book. I thought it was all in all pretty decent. So basically The Epic of Gilgamesh, if you don't know, was like a story that was written by like the ancient Mesopotamians. So like this stuff like predates the Bible. And in fact, like the story of Noah's Ark famously is like thought to derive from the Epic of Gilgamesh. I mean, it is like completely, you could tell it's Noah's Ark because I mean there's everything. There's like they go on the boat, I think they have the animals on the boat. There's even something about like releasing a dove for 3 days, and I think they land on top of a mountain after this like global flood. So I mean it's Noah's Ark, and again this like predates the Bible, so that's, you know, really interesting. And it's a real short read. It's only like, I don't know, 30-40 pages or something like that, so real easy to read. So I enjoyed it. The Epic of Gilgamesh I thought is a pretty good read. So also if you're trying to like catch up on your reading goal for the year, like a 40-50 page book, and then you could say, oh yeah, I've read this like ancient Mesopotamian tale. That sounds pretty cool to do that. I mean, you're probably reading like the oldest like form of story like known to man beyond like cave paintings. So The Epic of Gilgamesh, B tier, definitely worth reading. Next is Tender is the Night by F. Scott Fitzgerald. So F. Scott Fitzgerald is the author of The Great Gatsby, which is like one of the most, you know, popular books ever written, and I just did not like that book at all. So I think F. Scott Fitzgerald is just an author who just doesn't appeal to me. I probably think he is just grossly overrated. I read somewhere close to like 100 pages of this book. I can't even really say what it is about because I don't know, but basically what I got from it was like these families were like on this trip to like southern France, like the coast of France, and they were hanging out at the beach, and there was like this woman who was like some movie star or something, and she kind of got like in with this other family who's like seen her movies, and I think she may have been like kind of getting into like a, not an affair, but definitely heading that way with one of the guys. And anyway, just nothing about the book worked for me, so I just don't think I like F. Scott Fitzgerald's writing. So Tender is the Night, D tier. Is E.M. Forster, A Passage to India? Again, this is a book I can't really say much about it. I don't even remember much about it now. The book just didn't work for me, so it goes into D tier. Next is Dubliners by James Joyce. So this is a book I did not read a single word of this book for two main reasons, I think. One is because James Joyce is a stream of consciousness writer. I do not like stream of consciousness writing. I have hated like every stream of consciousness writer I have tried, like Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, Virginia Woolf, just Samuel Beckett, just all these stream of consciousness writers. I do not like that style at all. I think it's basically garbage. I think it's just, thank you, baby. I think it's some writer sits down at a keyboard or a typewriter or whatever and just writes whatever comes to their mind. And then without editing it or without thought, they just publish it, maybe as a first draft. And I just don't like it. To me, that's not like respectable writing. That's not an art form. That's just like doodling. So I hate stream of consciousness writing. Bird. The other thing about this book I didn't like is that the like editor of the book had the book with, I think, dashes instead of quotation marks, because the author, James Joyce, like throughout his life, he was trying to figure out what kind of style he liked. And eventually, I think he kind of settled on using dashes instead of quotation marks for dialogue. And that just drives me crazy. I hate when authors do not use quotation marks. I think every writer should use quotation marks for dialogue. I think it is real arrogant for authors to just think like, oh no, I am too good to use quotation marks. At least James Joyce or this editor or whatever used dashes, which at least lets you know that's dialogue, but still, I just hate that. I think every writer in the world should use quotation marks for dialogue. So, because of that, I am not reading James Joyce. Screw that. He's a stream of consciousness writer who does not use quotation marks. So, Dubliners by James Joyce gets E tier. I am not reading anything by him. Screw him. Use quotation marks and don't do stream of consciousness writing. I'm not interested. E tier. Hate it. Next is The Undertaking by Thomas Lynch. I have a signed copy of this book. This book is written by an undertaker, and it's about dealing with dead bodies and like families who had just lost a loved one. And so that is real interesting. Like, you've probably never read a book like that before. I know I haven't. So that's real interesting, and some of the writer's like humor is very good and refreshing, and it's just keeps you into it. But he also tends to use the same lines over and over and over again. Like, he's like, oh, that's a funny line. I'll use that 15 times. And it just gets tiresome. So the first time it's like, oh, that's kind of a cool line. The second time you're like, dude, you just used that line. The third, fourth, fifth, 10th, 15th time, you're just like, dude, you've used up the joke. It's not funny anymore. Stop it. And then also about a third of the way through, he started talking about religion a lot. So I just didn't like that. At that point, I was just, nope, this book is not for me. So ranking this book is difficult. I am going to give it C tier, but it's kind of another higher C tier. I would probably still recommend it to people because maybe the religion stuff won't bother you like it did me. And maybe parts of the humor that I thought were tiresome, the repetition of the humor, maybe you'll like that. And again, the book is very unique. A book written by an undertaker about dealing with dead bodies and stuff. That's interesting. So maybe you'll enjoy it. So it's really difficult to rank. It could be B tier, it could be C tier. I'm giving it C tier, but it's a higher C tier. Next is Betty MacDonald, Anybody Can Do Anything. I'd never heard of this book or author before, but there is a signed book by this author at the bookstore, and apparently the author died in like 1940s or 1950s or something like that. So it's a real kind of older author. So that did make me interested in reading this book because I wanted to read this book to see if I liked it before getting the signed book by her because it's $100. So I began reading this book last night, and by the second sentence, I was like, uh-oh, I'm not liking this. And the reason is, it's kind of silly, but because she says something like mother and daddy. And that bothered me because I'm like, why would you say mother and daddy? Either say mommy and daddy or say mother and father. Don't mix them up. Don't say mother and daddy. That just kind of set me off right from the start, and I know it's silly. But then the second paragraph, I did not like it. I thought she was way overwriting her book, like just trying to add like descriptive words for everything and to add like adjectives for everything. So not just saying like, someone was a farmer. She would say like they're a fabulous farmer, and not just saying they're an electrician. They're a spectacular electrician and all this stuff. And it was just driving me crazy. It's like, you're way overwriting this, lady. And so I kept reading, and then like page 2, I did an eye roll. Page 3, I did an eye roll. Page 4, page 5, page 6, page 7, page 8, I did eye rolls. And then finally by page 9, not even all the way through it, I was just like, nope. I do not like this writer. I do not like this person writing this book. I do not like her. I do not think she's funny. I think she's way overwriting this book. I just can't stand this. I'm not going to read any more of this. I hate this. This is terrible. I'm not reading anything else by her. Thank God I read this book now instead of buying the signed book by her, because I do not want to pay $100 for a signed book by this author. I would pay maybe $10 and then put the book, like hide it away, out of sight, out of mind. I did not like this book that much, and it took me 9 pages to know that. Really, I could have known after the second paragraph, really after the first like sentence where the like mother and daddy thing, that set me off. Right at that point, I knew this book is going to have problems, and it did. So I hated this book. It gets E tier. Screw that. Hate it. Do not like this author. E tier. Nope, bad. Done with it. Moving on. Next is Henry Miller, Black Spring. So I tried to read another book by Henry Miller. I think his first book. I want to say Tropic of Cancer. I think maybe Tropic of Capricorn. I think it's Tropic of Cancer though. I think that was his first book. And the reason I was interested in Henry Miller is because I was watching a debate on YouTube between Gore Vidal and Norman Mailer. And Norman Mailer said that Henry Miller was the greatest like living writer in the world. So that made me interested to read him. So I started with Tropic of Cancer, I think, his first book, I believe. And I absolutely hated that book. I kind of wish I could read a passage of that book to show you guys just how bad it is. This book, Black Spring, is another book on the top 1,000 list, or maybe it's the only book by him on the top 1,000 list. And what's kind of funny about it is I actually read like 3 chapters maybe, and I didn't even realize that it was a collection of short stories. So I thought I was reading like all of the same story, but then I looked it up and I saw it's actually a collection of short stories. So I was kind of like, oh, that's why none of these chapters make sense. They're all different stories. But I didn't like any one of them. Just none of them worked for me. The writing or storytelling, nothing about it ever worked for me. So I just do not get Henry Miller at all. I think Norman Mailer only liked him because he was obscene. So because of that, Norman Mailer was like, ooh, he uses profanity and obscene stuff in his books. That makes him a great writer. I don't think so. I think he's a terrible writer. He didn't do anything good writing. He was just obscene. That's all he was. So I didn't like it one bit. So Black Spring gets... It gets D tier actually, because again, it wasn't a book I hated as I was reading it. I didn't even know it was short stories. I was just not into this book at all, so it gets D tier. Next is Rohinton Mistry, A Fine Balance. I got a signed copy of this book, which I was pretty excited about, especially when I looked on Wikipedia, because I was curious about this book. Since I got a signed copy, I wanted to know, because I'd never heard of this book or author before, I kind of wanted to know, like, what is this book? Is this a good book? Is this a good author? Am I buying something that's really cool, or is this just whatever? So I looked it up and I saw on Wikipedia that it said this book, A Fine Balance, is often mentioned as one of the 10 greatest books to ever come out of Asia, which I thought was real cool. Like, wow, high expectations there. So I began reading it, and right away I realized this author was very much like my own writing style. Just like everything about our writing is identical. Our use of description, our use of dialogue, the way we describe setting, the way we describe characters, our vocabulary, our sentence structure, just everything about our writing is identical. The only other writer who I felt that way for, just a book very much similar with my own, is Richard Wright, the author of Native Son. Just our vocabulary, our sentence structure, our use of description, our use of dialogue is all just identical to each other. We're like clones of each other. So it was real quite, what's the word I'm looking for? It was really rewarding to me to know that this author's writing style was so well liked, and that this book is known as one of the 10 greatest books to ever come out of Asia. Because if my writing is just like this guy's without even trying to emulate it, like this is just my own natural writing style, and this guy gets a lot of praise, I thought, well, hey, my writing can't be that bad either. I write just like this. So that was cool. So anyway, reading the book, of course, I liked it because of the writing so similar to my own. So the first maybe 100 or 200 pages, I was like, this is definitely going to have to be a 5-star book. This is a great writer. But as it kept going, I was kind of waiting for something to happen with the plot. And basically the story is about several different characters in India, and they're all kind of like poor lower class people kind of, and it's about them trying to like work and get ahead, and it goes into their like family life and their family history, and it's all pretty well written, I thought. But the problem was the book just didn't really feel like it was going anywhere. Like I was just waiting, like, is there going to be a war or something? Is there going to be a love interest here? I mean, what is going to keep pushing the story along? He's just talking about characters, and he tells a whole character's story kind of, and then he jumps to another character. And I was like, isn't something bigger going to happen? So that was kind of the main problem of the book, is just nothing was much happening. So after like 250 pages, maybe 300 pages, I don't know, I just got so bored waiting for something to happen. And again, this is like a big book. I mean, it's like a 600-700 page book. So I looked up the book summary on Wikipedia, I think, and I was glad I did that, because the ending of the book was so depressing. Like, nothing good happens in the end. It's just misfortune falls every character, and it's just such a bad, sad, tragic ending. So that was just a punch in the gut. It was just like reading all of this for that, and it's just that sucks. And again, the book was just so slow to move, and there was no light in it. There was no real good characters. The main characters of the story were pretty decent. Like, I liked them well enough, but they were the only good characters. There was no one else in the book who I liked. No one I rooted for. No characters who like made me laugh or anything. The book was just so dreary kind of, and it just really made me not like India or like Pakistan or Muslims, but most especially India. So I don't really know what this author was going for, because basically this book just made me hate Indians. Like, just, they're so classist, they're so racist, they're so sexist. I just did not like these people at all. So I don't know. So the writing's I'm talking way too much about this book. Anyway, so the writer's style, very much like my own. I liked that. I liked the first 200 pages of the book, but after that, the book was just so slow. The characters unlikable, the plot not going anywhere, and the ending was so tragic and just such a letdown. This book can really get any ranking from like S tier to E tier. Probably not E tier, but I'm going to give it B tier, so it is a recommended read. But yeah, I mean, I did have problems with it. The biggest one is probably the length and the plot just going so slow and the ending just kind of sucking. But I would still probably recommend you try this book out, see the writer's style. I mean, you know, I'm very partial to the writer's style. But try it out. I thought it's definitely a book with a lot of potential. Some of the writing I thought was real good. And again, that's like, you know, kind of commending myself there. But anyway, so the book gets B tier. All in all, I liked it more than I didn't like it, but I am glad I did not read the whole thing. I do have a couple other books by Rohinton Mistry. I think his first 2 books. I think he's only written 3 books. So I want to read the other stuff he's written, and we'll see how it goes. So, a fine balance, B tier. This is so difficult right now because I have the bird just like staring at me like through the corner of the cage. So I'm just having a bird stare at me while I'm trying to do this video. Okay, but the next book is, I don't know how to pronounce a name, but Azar reading Lolita in Tehran. So Lolita by Nabokov, I think is a book on the top 1000 list, but that is a book where I refuse to read it. And the reason is because Lolita is a book about like this guy, I don't know his age exactly, he's like 40 years old or something. And basically the whole book, Lolita, is him molesting like his, I don't know, like 12-year-old niece or something like that. That is the whole book. So screw that, I'm not reading that book. So this book, I picked it up, and the first chapter I thought was actually quite masterful. In fact, I tweeted the author and just told her, like, you know, hey, that was one of the best first chapters I had ever read. But after that, the book just did not work for me at all, because basically the book was a lot of description, and the description didn't work for me. Like, a lot of the book was describing like the colors of the outfits these girls would wear when they would show up at this woman's house. The author was like a teacher in Iran, and so she had like group meetings with all these different girls to talk about different books. One of them is Lolita by Nabokov, and I think she also talks about Jane Austen and another book as well. And so that's all the book is just talking about their discussions about these books. The first one being Lolita. And that is kind of where the book lost me, because these scenes just read like a college professor who is just really into Nabokov giving a lecture about Lolita. It wasn't this story really I felt about these girls in Iran reading this like banned book or whatever. So the book just didn't work for me. It was just a book by an author who is just really obsessed with Lolita. I am not interested in that. Nothing about the book worked for me because of that. It's just like, man, this writer loves Lolita. And so that just didn't work for me. That's all the book was just praising Lolita and praising Nabokov. And so the book didn't work for me. Nothing about the writing after that point worked for me. So the first chapter, masterful. After that, complete dud. So I'm going to give it a little bit of extra credit for the first chapter. So I'm going to give this book C tier. It does fall out of recommended reading territory, but maybe this is a book that is also higher C tier. Maybe it's like mid-high C tier. So possibly you may want to check it out. And if you read it and like the first chapter and like the second chapter, maybe you're going to like the book more than I did. Especially if you've read Lolita, maybe you'll definitely like the book more than I did as well, since I haven't read that book. Next is Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. So this is a real difficult book for me to review, kind of, because I do like a lot of Ayn Rand's like politics. I read one of her books called Capitalism, The Unknown Ideal, which is just a collection of essays by different writers, one of them being her. And that was my first introduction to Ayn Rand, and I liked a lot of it. I like her views on capitalism. I like her politics. So let's get that point over with first. Ayn Rand is a very divisive figure. You either love her or hate her. So politically, I like her okay. I'm not obsessed with her. I'm not like in some cult following for her. I don't worship every word she says, but I agree with most of what she says. I like her. As for the book itself, Atlas Shrugged is definitely one of those books that falls into like a cult classic kind of. I mean, people love, love, love this book, and other people hate it because they hate Ayn Rand. So I was real curious how I would fall into one of those groups, because, and also in part, the book is real long. It's like 1,300 pages, which is crazy. But I began reading it, and I actually really like her writing ability. I thought Ayn Rand, reading this book, is actually a real gifted writer. Her writing was just quite beautiful, perfect, and masterful. It read very much like a literary classic, a great American novel, kind of. And so, yeah, I definitely want to stress that point. Real good writing. She's a good writer. And I like her politics a lot for the most part. But the problem with this book was when she tried to blend the two, her good writing with her politics, it came out really bad, I think. Like there was a scene where she had this businessman talking to all these people, and he was saying how, like, I'm not exaggerating here. He was saying like, yes, I do not care if I do bad business. I don't care if I have bad business policies. I don't care if I go bankrupt. I don't care if I lose business. My only objective is to do good for society. I only want to help people. So yeah, my business is probably going to fall apart soon and I'm probably going bankrupt and all this stuff. But you know what? I just believe it's so much more important to do good for society. And just no one would say this kind of stuff. So that was just really over the top and real bad. I get what Ayn Rand was trying to do perfectly. I understand the point she was making, and I even agree with it. And I saw oh, I get it. I get what she's talking about. She's talking about capitalism and free markets and socialism and all this stuff. So I get what she's doing and why. But it was just so terribly inserted. I mean, she'd have good writing, masterful writing, and then she'd get to these scenes where it's like, aha, now I'm going to talk politics and I'm going to really dish on socialism and communism and I'm going to go after it and I'm going to make them look like complete idiots here. And it's just, she does this so poorly, like no one would say this. And it's just ruining an otherwise good book. So, because of that, those political scenes really killed the book for me. And it's just so weird about that because it's like, I should like those scenes because I like her politics for the most part. But it just killed the book for me. So, real good writing. I like her politics. I think she can make some good political points. But she cannot really combine her good writing with her politics. It just didn't mix well. So, real unfortunate, and also again the length of the book is real bad, like 1400 pages. The book should have been cut by like 700 pages, seriously. And also those scenes, those political scenes, should have been like reworked completely. So it's real difficult for me. It's a book that is like so close to being like a 5-star book for some of those like good written scenes, but because of all the problems I have with the book, it does fall out of recommended reading territory. I am going to give it a C tier. Maybe it gets like a higher C tier slightly. Next is William Shakespeare, Richard II. So not every book by Shakespeare is actually on the top 1000 list. There are probably like 9 of his plays that are on the top 1000 list, one of them being Richard II. And this is kind of the first, in fact it is, the first Shakespeare book I've read since high school. So in high school, of course, we read like Julius Caesar and Romeo and Juliet and maybe another one. And like I was in a drama class and we did A Midsummer Night's Dream or whatever. I don't even think I was in the play. I don't even know what I was doing in that class. But yeah, anyway. So Richard II was my first kind of real experience delving into Shakespeare, and I wasn't sure what to expect because I kind of feared, remembering him from school, he could kind of be quite over the top. So I began reading it and I read the whole thing, Richard II, and I was really quite impressed with some of it. I mean, it was really clear. William Shakespeare was like the god of English. In fact, it kind of made me cry. In fact, I'm probably going to start crying now because his use of English, it was just so masterful. Some of the lines he came up with, just so beautiful. Just like, how did he think of that line? So he really was the god of English. And again, I did like a lot of the lines in that play, Richard II. So this is a play that I think is kind of one of his lesser popular plays. I mean, I never hear about Richard II. It's always like, Much Ado About Nothing, Julius Caesar, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth. I never hear about Richard II, but I liked it very well. And there were lines that just made me cry really because it is just So beautifully written, so wonderfully conceived. How did he come up with that? I'm crying right now. It was that good. So I definitely completely respect William Shakespeare as the god of English. He deserves that title. So, Richard II I liked very much, and it gets B tier. It is a book that might actually get bumped up a tier, possibly A or even S tier, depending on how the rest of my reads for Shakespeare goes. But so far, I think it's a B tier book. Very good. Definitely worth reading. Do not skip it because it's kind of a more obscure play or whatever. I thought it was great. Some of the lines, chef's kiss, perfect, beautiful, genius. Next is The Tempest, also by William Shakespeare. This is a play I had heard about more, and this one did nothing for me whatsoever. There is not really a single line that made me think, that was a great line. The most famous line from this play, I think, is what's past his prologue, which is itself kind of a cool line. But when I got to that line in the play, I was just like, what does that even mean? What does it have to do with anything that's going on? What does that mean? So the whole play just didn't work for me. I didn't really get what was going on in the whole play. I mean, I understood it was like people from like Genoa on the ship, and there's like this storm, and that's really all I knew about it. There was also like some mermaid creatures or like some kind of creatures of some kind on the ship, and I just really didn't get what was going on in this play at all. The Tempest, just the language, it just didn't work for me. There was nothing about it that I thought was even good. So I do not know if that was just like a dud of a play by Shakespeare, or if it was just like so far beyond me. Maybe Shakespeare's writing was just so far evolved at that point that I cannot even relate with it anymore. I cannot understand it anymore. Basically, at this point, I am just like a toddler and I do not know what he is saying. He is speaking some other language. He is in a plane of existence higher than me. I just do not understand it. I do not know if that's the case or if he was just trying to be real clever and just not good at it. I don't know. That is probably not the case. The more likely case is I am just too stupid to understand what is going on here. Because I'm sure other people do understand this play perfectly. I just couldn't. It just didn't work for me at all. So, The Tempest gets D tier. Did not work for me at all. Next is Robert L. Stevenson, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So I had already read two other books by R.L. Stevenson. Treasure Island, which I thought was real good, and Kidnapped, which I didn't really like that much, except for one scene where they're on this boat and these people are trying to like storm this cabin, and this boy and this guy are like fending them off. That was a real cool scene from Kidnapped. But anyway, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I read that a lot of people reading R.L. Stevenson, their favorite book by him was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So that made me a lot more enthusiastic about reading it. It is on the top 1,000 list, of course, since it's on this list. So I read the whole thing and I enjoyed it. And I definitely can respect that, you know, it's kind of ahead of its time because it's talking about like duality and stuff and like this guy who is two different people kind of. And that was just very new at the time, I think. But kind of the biggest problem for me with this book was pretty much everyone knows Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is the same person. I mean, I'm not even going to put a spoiler warning there. People just kind of know that. They're the same guy. Somehow this guy turns into this monster, Mr. Hyde. And so reading this book, the book like tries to keep it a mystery, like what is going on here? Like there's even a point where they have like, they see that this letter that is supposed to be from, I forget who it is, either Mr. Hyde or Dr. Jekyll. They see that it's written by the same guy. So at that point, it's like obvious, like it's written by the same guy. It's the same guy. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is the same guy. Can you not see that? And that's kind of where the failing is, because nowadays, since everyone knows Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde's story, everyone knows the story, they know it's the same guy. There's no mystery to it. But in this book, R.L. Stevenson tried to keep it a mystery. So it just didn't really work for me because I knew it's the same guy. But I did like at the very end, because at the very end it explains kind of what was going on, how this guy, Dr. Jekyll, became Mr. Hyde, how Mr. Hyde formed, how he took over, and basically, it tells how all this came about. And that was interesting. But that only came at the very end of the book. So anyway, all in all, I did like the book for sure, but it was real hard to properly enjoy it because I already knew how it ended. I knew it's the same guy. So it didn't really work for me for that reason. I didn't get the same enjoyment out of it the readers at the time would have. So it's a real difficult book to judge. That said, I do give Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde B tier. I think it's a recommended read. It's definitely worth reading, and that way also you could say you read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So it's not a book I think you'll be disappointed reading. It's a good book and it should be read. But I don't think it works as good as it should because you know how it turns out. You know it's the same guy. Hopefully I did not spoil that for you. Next is Donna Tartt, The Secret History, and I got a signed book right over here, The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt, which is pretty cool, a signed book by her. So I previously picked this book up from the library several years ago, and I read like the first 50 pages or so, and I thought it was overall pretty good. But then like COVID hit, so I didn't have the book for like, 3-4 years or something. But I picked it up again. I think I actually bought a copy because the library didn't have a copy anymore. So I bought a copy and I read it. And I read probably like 80% of it before losing interest. And basically the reason why is because I realized after like 80% through, I just didn't really care about these characters anymore. Or if I cared about them at all, I just didn't care about the characters. So basically the the plot of this book is about this guy from California goes to this school in like, the New England area, and he kind of tries to get in this Greek class where there's only like 4 other students, and it's like real like just gifted students, and all they do all day is like read and translate Greek. And so that was all real interesting, and I liked that, especially because I know a little Greek myself, which is kind of cool. So that was interesting, and I liked it. And then basically there winds up being like a murder that goes on. And I actually forgot in the start of the book that it says talking about the murder. So I got like 150 pages in and finally got to where this murder happens, and I was like, wait, what? Hang on, I actually remember something about that. And I checked the first page of the book and it says something about the murder. So I was kind of like, oh, it tells you on page 1 that there's this murder, and it doesn't actually show you that till like page 150 or 200. So that's kind of like spoiling the whole thing. But I forgot about that because I returned the book to the library. Anyway, so about 80% in, I just realized I did not care about the characters. So I just like looked up the summary of the book, and I was just like, parts of the writing were good, but just the characters just didn't do anything for me. So I was like, well, I'm not going to recommend this book. So I thought it would be a C tier book. But the more I thought about it, I realized I read like 80% of this book, and without even caring about the characters really, I was invested in the book up until then. I liked the book up until then. So in that way, even though I didn't really like the characters, I was invested in the characters and I was invested in the story. So I think Donna Tartt, I should give her more credit for that, because she did keep me hooked for so long without having characters that I really liked or cared about. So she definitely does have some major talent to do that. So because of that, I have to give the book a little bit of an upgrade, and I'm going to give it B tier. I think it is definitely a book with a lot of potential, but with that caveat that the characters just didn't really work for me. But I had to realize then that they really did work for me because I read 80% of the book and liked it until that point. So, I'm conflicted on this book, but I do have to admit Donatar is definitely a talented writer, especially to pull that off. So, B tier. Next is Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. I don't really need to say much here because this is poetry. I'm not a fan of poetry. I tried to read like 4 different poems randomly in the book, and I did not even get to the second verse of any of those poems. It's just not for me. I do not like poetry, so it gets D tier. Next is John Updike, The Maple Stories, and I have a signed book somewhere here by John Updike, which I think is real cool. So I was kind of excited to read this book, and I was talking with a bookstore owner about John Updike, and I asked him what he thought of John Updike, and he said that John Updike is a very difficult writer to talk about because he just does everything very well. So he's kind of an author where it's just good all around. What can you say about it? It's just good. It's John Updike. And so that kind of made me intrigued about reading it. So I picked this book up, The Maple Stories. I read like the first 2 or 3 stories. It's kind of like short stories, but they're also like connected. It's like the same family or something like that. So it's connected short stories. But I didn't really think it was altogether that good. I mean, I thought it was okay maybe, but not good. So all in all, I thought it was just all around okay. And to me, that just is kind of a D tier book. It's just okay, not good, not great, not bad, not terrible, just okay. So I can't really say anything good about it whatsoever. It's just okay. So I think it's just a book not for me. I'm not sure if I'm going to read anything else by John Updike. Maybe I'll try to read the signed book I have by him. Or maybe I know like he wrote a rabbit series. Like that's the name of the main character or something. So I may try reading the first book in that series, maybe just to see if that's any better. I'm not a fan of short stories, so maybe the Maple Stories is just not a real good place to start out on, especially for me. So I don't know, but it does definitely lower my like ranking or wanting to read John Updike. It's just not for me. Next is Virgil, the Aeneid, and this was also a book I talk about in my February wrap-up. So the Aeneid is a book by this Latin or ancient Roman writer Virgil about a continuation of the Trojan War. Basically what he does is he takes a character who I think appears in Homer's Iliad, The Fall of Troy, and he has that character like go to Carthage and then journey up to Italy, and he founds Rome. So basically the Romans are the descendants of the fallen Trojan Empire, which is pretty interesting. I didn't like this book for a few reasons, though. One of them is I didn't like that they were all Roman gods, like Jupiter and, oh man, what's her name? Not Hera, Juno. And yeah, those were just bothering me because I was like, no, it's not Jupiter, it's Zeus. No, it's not Juno, it's Hera. That was bothering me. I like the Greek gods. And also like, just ripping off the Greeks, and that was bothering me. And so Virgil is also ripping off Homer, so he's just taking the Iliad and ripping it off and telling a Roman version of it. And also I just didn't get why the Romans would want to have themselves founded by the Trojans, because the Trojans lost, they fell, they're losers. So why would you want to like have your city founded by losers who were conquered? That just tells you that you're going to fall just like them because you are losers too. So I just didn't really get that. I didn't really like the book too much. So I don't know. One thing I have to say is that Virgil wrote it actually like as a poem. So he wrote it like, I don't know how it works exactly, but it has something to do with meter. Like each line has so many syllables and like the syllables rhyme or something like that. So that is all like very artistic for sure. But I did not get that at all because this is a translation and it reads like a novel, not like a poem or whatever. So I don't get like all that rhyming structure of the syllables. So because of that, I am really not reading Virgil's The Aeneid. I am reading a modern translation of it, trying to put it into modern words a reader could understand. So I am just kind of reviewing the translator's Aeneid, not Virgil's Aeneid, because I didn't read Virgil's Aeneid and he died before finishing it. But I just didn't really like it too much. I definitely like the Iliad. The Iliad is pretty good. I'm still reading it actually. And I like a lot of like Greek playwrights, like, well, I've read Aristophanes and Aeschylus, and my favorite was Sophocles. He's the only one I really actually like. But anyway, so Virgil, the Aeneid, it just didn't really do anything for me. I didn't like all the Roman gods and the Romans trying to just steal the story about the Trojans founding Rome. It just didn't work for me, but I don't know, it's okay. It's an okay book. So it gets C tier. Maybe it's a book you want to pick up and give a try. I mean, that's definitely interesting. The Romans coming from the, like, fallen Trojan Empire. That's pretty interesting. That's cool. But all in all, it's not really a book I would recommend, so it gets C tier. Last of all is Voltaire. I don't know how to pronounce it at all, but Candide. So I know Voltaire was basically around the time of like Thomas Jefferson, and I know he was a real kind of edgy writer at the time, but I didn't know anything about him otherwise. I thought going into it that Voltaire would be like real kind of like wordy, just a lot of words, real long words, real confusing, real intellectual read. But this was definitely not that at all. This was actually a real simple read and a real easy and an actual good read. And it read a lot like The Princess Bride. So what this book is about, Candide, or however it's pronounced, is that it's kind of like a fairy tale-esque book where this guy, I don't know who he is exactly, but he's some kind of like minor lordling, I think. He has some kind of position of power. Real kind of like middle though. Or maybe he's like the son of a king, I don't know. But he like is in Eastern Europe, and I think the Prussians are kind of like the big bad guys at the time. So they're kind of like the evil empire at the time, the Prussians. And so what it's about is it's this guy, he is really interested in, like this prince, this guy is really interested in this princess who is actually like this real kind of overweight, ugly girl, which is just a flip of the usual convention of like the princess being like the most beautiful girl alive. This princess is kind of this fat, ugly chick. And that's pretty funny because it's just like, that's what this prince likes. He thinks this girl is beautiful. He really desires her. And I just like that. It was real funny. And just the whole book is kind of that way. Just some real funny things happen and also some very edgy stuff as well. Like I think a couple like clergymen get killed or something in the book. Basically, the book is about like misfortune kind of following this guy wherever he goes, and he goes really all around like the Western world, Europe, and I think Africa, maybe parts of Africa possibly, and the Americas. And it's just kind of this adventure, and he's trying to wind up with his princess. And it goes from there. I think Voltaire wrote it because like some philosopher at the time had some like philosophy that like everything is okay, everything is fine, everything's going to work out, God will control everything. And so Voltaire wrote this to kind of like counter that. Like Voltaire was like, no, not everything's going to be fine, bad things happen. Crap happens, and maybe nothing good is ever going to happen. Things are pretty miserable. And so that's kind of what this is about. This guy is just trying to like have a good ending, and just bad things keep happening to him. But it's not really a like tragic story to read. It's actually a pretty funny story. Again, I compared a lot to The Princess Bride. It reads like a satirical fairy tale, like just a fairy tale turned over on its head. turned over on its head. And it's just all in all a real good read, and it's a simple read. It's not a real intellectual, wordy book like I thought it would be. It read like The Princess Bride. Maybe a bit more of an anti-religious Princess Bride, but still it read like A Princess Bride by William Goldman, a book I absolutely love. So I definitely do recommend this book, Candide, or however it's pronounced, by Voltaire. Definitely a recommended read. Definitely an enjoyable read. I will say that part of the book is more difficult to enjoy or appreciate now because a lot of the things in the book, like, you know, killing the clergyman, that's not quite as, like, edgy as it might have been in its time. Like, in its time, you know, that's something you may get arrested for. Like, oh my God, you killed a clergyman in this book. You know, sinner, you infidel, whatever. So that's something Voltaire did that would have been more shocking in its time. And I can appreciate that, but it's definitely doesn't have the same weight as it would today. It's just kind of like, oh, he killed a priest, you know, oh, uh-oh. But it's not as shocking today to read it. But it is still a very good book, I thought, worth reading. So I am actually going to give Candide by Voltaire A tier. I think it's definitely a book you should read. It's a good book, worth reading. A tier. And that is it. So thank you guys for watching. I will hopefully do another one of these videos once I have another 25 books or so to read off the top 1000 list. So thank you guys for watching. See you next time. Bye.
2, 3, 4.